what I don't see yoga people doing is really taking responsibility for the personal, private needs that drive them to one sector or other of the yoga literature that's available to us. And I think if we can study that, if we identify our needs with regard to yoga, I think we can, or yogas, I think we can start to understand what it is we reach for, and then why we might go on and make the mistake that you're describing of trying to define it for everybody else.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. We've got an interesting show in store for today. Now, as a yoga teacher, I often hear or am a part of conversations between people on social media or in person about what yoga is or isn't. Often there's someone claiming that something that they're doing is the real yoga, and what someone else doing isn't even real yoga. And it's often done by people with a pretty limited scope of what the practice is anyways. Maybe they've picked up Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and now they feel that they're in the place where they can talk about what yoga is to someone who's just doing a postural practice or something like that. And it's an unfortunate thing that we see the division behind it, but it is a very important conversation to have in our community. And to have this conversation with us today, we're really lucky. We have someone whose work I very much admire. He's an author, a yoga teacher, an Ayurvedic consultant. He's a cultural critic, as well as a very vocal leader in our yoga community. Happy to have him on the show today. Matthew Remski, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Ashton. It's a pleasure.
So we're here to talk about how to define yoga and really get into if it's even necessary to define it. But before we dive down that rabbit hole, I'd love if our listeners could get a sense of who you are, a little bit of your history and what led you to do the work that you do and to be such a great and powerful voice for the yoga community. Well,
to speak to the last point, I think if I'm a powerful voice, that's, I think, maybe a measure of just how loud and obnoxious and opinionated I can be. And also, it comes out of the fact that for me, writing has been like an essential therapy that has taken many forms over the years. And I can be a little bit compulsive about it. My productivity alone can be off-putting to people. And there's somebody, I was just with Gina Caputo actually in Colorado, and she said, we were doing a weekend, and she said, I have some constructive feedback for you. I said, lay it on me. I'd love to hear it. She said, you publish so much, and I think there might be, a kind of intimidation factor when it comes down to people actually meeting you in person, but you're a lot more personable than you are in person than you are on the page. And it made me realize that writing is also non-conversational. And that means that I often have this, there's almost this split in my life between being perceived as a wall of words when really most of the time I want to hang out and have tea. And there's a lot of stuff wrapped up in there as well around writing as a kind of defensiveness against inadequacy and all of that. And that goes way back into my youth.
Well, and what I love that you're even talking about right now, and it's one of the things I admire most about you, and it probably adds to the long list of extra wordiness, but you come across as someone who is extremely reflective and willing to have the difficult conversations. And that to me, I really admire, because you always seem to not only be looking at the process outwardly, but inwardly as well, and reflecting on what your motivations might be and where you are with it. And to me, I think we could all be served by doing more of that. So I really appreciate that. And it's very evident in the work that you do and the writing that you do.
Well, cool. I mean, I think that especially in a performative, social media saturated, visual culture saturated subculture that we inhabit, that really pushes back against what I think is the core medium of yoga itself, which is interoception. I think it's really important for us to deconstruct as much as we can how we present ourselves, as much as we try to put forward constructive work. And I think it's kind of a new form of self-inquiry, is to be aware of how one is presenting oneself and what one's biases are and where one is coming from. I think if you're not doing that, you're kind of outside of the pathway, if it can be called traditional, of yoga inquiry, of looking at why you do what you do. If it's about understanding your tendencies, your karma, if you will, I think why you're doing what you're doing has to be front and center in some way.
Absolutely. Well, and so give us a little bit about your why you got involved with yoga in the first place, why you are so compelled to be such a vocal presence in the community, and really, I think, shining a light on some dark areas in the community as well, which is awesome. But what got you interested in this work and involved in this work?
Well, the spotlighting stuff, I think, has to do with deep childhood things, including my almost complete immersion as a child in the Catholic Church, at a boys' choir school here in Toronto called St. Michael's Choir School. And I think actually, I've got many different starting points for yogic sensibility, but I remember listening to this program on the CBC at about 2:00 in the morning. It ran late, and I was maybe 14 or 15 years old, and Leonard Cohen had just released with Jennifer Warnes a record called Famous Blue Raincoat, and Brent Banbury was the host, and he was interviewing them both, and I don't remember anything about that night except the lines from Joan of Arc, where she sings something like, I have always longed for love and light, but must it come so cruel, must it come so bright? She sings to Fire, who's actually played by Leonard Cohen. And that kind of pointer towards the reality of shadow energy within every religious or spiritual aspiration really broke me apart. It also made me feel at home and a little bit less insane than I had felt, because it suggested that, the better, more elevated, more close to God you try to be, the more neurotic or anxious or violent you might actually feel. And getting that out into the open, I think, began there. It picked up speed over the years, to the point where I can kind of locate that as a starting point. But that's really been my focus. And I think when you actually ask me later, what do I think yoga is, I'll probably refer back to this too. But how did I start practicing postures? That came years later. After using writing, with moderate success to, keep me clinging on in the midst of what was probably a clinical depression. And I also, I was introduced to Buddhism about 4 or 5 years before I did a single posture. And that was good for certain things, but it didn't really reinvest me in my body, which I believe I left while I was in my preteens at choir school. And I was actually writing about this the other day. I think I left my body at a point at which, that sounds very dramatic, but it's like there was a definite distinction between me feeling like I was a boy and an embodied being and a person running around in the world when I was about 12, and me feeling completely shadowy and empty and wisp-like until I was maybe, 30 or 31 when I did my first asana class. And I think that moment happened when I had that splitting moment happened when I realized, how the authority figures in my school were treating us. It was one thing for me to be subjected to corporal punishment or verbal or emotional abuse, but I remember this one moment where I was able to see clearly another boy get strapped by the principal at the time, and I could see the injustice of the somatic situation. I could see that she was in control and he was completely debilitated. I could see that the entire energy or the structure of the system was set up to discipline my body. And I think, quite unconsciously, but quite palpably, I made a decision to leave my body and to feel like I was not in it, to dissociate. And I think that really came to an end, or at least it shifted when I took my first asana class in Manhattan in about 2000.
I had a similar experience where, I was exposed to postural practice at a young age when I was about 12, but in my mid to late teens, even early 20s, I suffered from a lot of insomnia. I was getting 2 to 4 hours of sleep a night most nights. Most of my dreams were lucid, so I was awake in my dreams, and I had a hard time figuring out the difference sometimes between realities, because it was like, am I in a dream or am I not? Because I'm awake in my dreams, I don't know. And I was very, very much not here at times. And it was through the yoga practice. I probably went a little further out at first with some of the shamanic work and some of the more ecstatic type of yogic practices, but it was really the physical asana practice that brought me back into my body as well. And that led back to the journey, which eventually led me to fatherhood and everything else of, oh, no, here's the world, this stuff right here, like let's be present in this. And that definitely changed as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. I think it's probably a common theme that hasn't been given enough air, actually. Mm-hmm.
Well, and let's use it as an opportunity to kind of dive into the topic. Before we even say, okay, let's define yoga as something, I think it's worth asking the question, do we need to define yoga? Is there a value in and setting a definition aside for it?
I think if we at least make flawed attempts at some definition, we keep ourselves in the ball game of inquiry. And, as I heard you pivot there, my first thought about defining yoga would have to do with how many people would resonate with bits of your story and bits of my story, who came to address those narratives through yoga practice. There's a demographic of people who have wound up in conversations like this, not because they did cross-country skiing or because they went into Pilates, but because they sought out some kind of embodied practice that had a lively philosophical and psychological discourse that was embedded within it, that was implicit within it. And that certainly, our elders continually pointed us towards, whether we wanted to take them up on it or not. But I think talking about what it is definitely is helpful, because if we leave it blank, marketing culture will define it. I mean, because that's what's at stake. What's at stake is that if thoughtful voices don't contribute to the definitional quagmire, there's plenty of definitions out there, and they're out there to basically make yoga part of the neoliberal anxious self-improvement project. And so, yeah, I think it's worthwhile to oppose that, even if we come up with a bunch of sloppy ideas.
So I want to go back for a moment and say, part of why we're having this conversation is because you had posted something on social media, which you're very active on, and it was a picture of you. It was one of your slides, and you were in the picture as well, where you have this kind of really nice, it's not necessarily a definition of yoga, but it's kind of a response to the question, well, what is yoga? And it was a really lovely thing. And if I can, I'll actually read it, because I have it here, and then maybe that can be a point for where we go on. But it really stimulated, man, I love that you said that, and I wanted to talk about it. So in a response to, so what is yoga anyways? You say, if you study hard in these days, which is because you were doing a workshop, you'll be able to say, that's a huge question. Throughout history and across cultures, people have answered it according to their needs and interests. For instance, and then in brackets, this text seems to say that yoga is blank, while this other text seems to say that yoga is blank. There are many other definitions as well. Its meaning in my life and practice so far has been blank. And what I love about that is it's very real in the sense that, like, you know what? As much as everyone wants to go around saying, well, this is real yoga and this is that, within yoga, no one says that, because there's such a diversity. Or if they say it within the context of like, well, I'm trying to say that, well, mine is better, and we're in that type of conversation, which, the value in that, I don't know. But in the sense of like, hey, yoga is so many different things to different people. There's so many different types of yoga practices. So you can't just say, well, yoga is meditation, or yoga is the 8 limbs. I mean, that's usually the big one that I hear, that people say, well, you know what? Asana isn't real yoga. There are 8 limbs to yoga. And all I hear when somebody says that is, you know what? My exposure to yoga is limited to Patanjali, because even Patanjali is a very limited scope of what yoga is and has been for the thousands of years that it's been around. So,
well, I think it's. I would agree, but shift direction a little bit and say that it's limited to the extent that the scholarship of the speaker is limited. It's not limited to the purported practitioner of Raja Yoga in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, for whom it might have been completely absorptive. One of the problems that we face is that we're exposed at once to a lot of different definitions and presentations of this incredibly polysemic word. I think Christopher Wallace says that it's the most polysemic word in Sanskrit. In other words, the word that can be defined in the most number of ways. And not only can it be variously defined, sometimes it is antonymically defined. That yoga, to take the Yoga Sutras for example, actually doesn't mean the joining of something in terms of some sort of ultimate result, but rather the text itself drives entirely towards kaivalya, or the isolation of the material world and the principle of awareness. And so, as Edwin Bryant says, it might have better been called the Ayoga Sutras, or the disconnecting sutras. And so we have this word that is, yes, it's polysemic, but we also have the problem of being postmodern bricoleurs with a little bit of scholarship and not a lot of grounding. And what I mean by that is that we can be aware that the yogas presented in the Gita, the sutras, the Yoga Vashista, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, are different. And because we are aware that they are different, and that there's virtually nobody who can be purely immersed in one of them without some sort of comparative doubt arising in their minds about, well, is this really the whole show, or should I dip into the Middle Ages as well? We're in this very odd position where we are practicing across not just time zones, but actually historical zones. We have to be aware that the principles of yoga are expressed in these polysemic ways, but we also somehow are aware that that means that we can choose, and then that gets really tricky because that can feed itself into consumer culture. Where we feel like we're going to taste a little bit out of the 3rd century of the Common Era, and then we're going to dip back into 1500 years before in the Upanishads, and then we're going to jump forward and we're going to read Garanda Samhita about all kinds of weird cleansings you can do with your intestines, and somehow we have to make this syncretic picture out of it. And what I really want to encourage people to do is to realize that they are at a buffet, and to recognize that it's easy to be, both a glutton and then also to realize that, some sort of balance of flavors is what everybody is after, but that also people are choosing. You're choosing what you like. You're choosing from this panoply of sources. And why are you making those choices? Why are some people really, really drawn to the nirguna expressions of Advaita Vedanta? Why are some people really drawn to the 10 Mahavidyas in the tantric traditions? What I don't see yoga people doing is really taking responsibility for the personal, private needs that drive them to one sector or other of the yoga literature that's available to us. And I think if we can study that, if we can be transparent about that, like, oh, I'm really into wrathful deities because I realize that, I have, I really want to work on transmuting anger. Or, oh, I'm really into the notion of, stilling the fluctuations of consciousness because I'm absolutely exhausted with my inner world. Or, oh, I really love the language of the Upanishads because it gives me, the ability to imagine unending radiance and to feel myself in the presence of something eternal and essential. If we identify our needs with regard to yoga, I think we can, or yogas, I think we can start to understand what it is we reach for, and then why we might go on and make the mistake that you're describing of trying to define it for everybody else. Because the history of modern yoga is littered with the wreckage of people who have tried to turn their subjective, fetishes and experiences into universal values.
How would you say, or what would you encourage people to do to start this inquiry for people that, okay, I go to yoga right now and, I don't really know why, but I'm getting something out of it. I'm interested in here and there. How do people start to have the inquiry within themselves to explore what their needs or what their drives behind it are? Because it almost seems like, well, the practice is kind of what's going to help them reflect on that, but then it's the practices are reflecting on why they're practicing, and it becomes a little muddled. What do you suggest for people to start that conversation at the very least?
Well, I think both things happen at the same time, that there are practices and then there are meta practices. I'm doing this thing, and whatever it is, whether it's the vinyasa flow class or it's breathing instruction or yoga nidra, I think a really great yogic question to ask that cuts across all lineages and time zones is really, why am I doing this? What value am I getting out of it? How is it changing me? And that's an interesting question because it chafes at the boundaries of belief and faith. It starts to, I think, allow a person maybe to shift from I'm going to do this because I've been told it's good for me to, boy, I'm making choices about my internal landscape all the time and how I'm going to orient myself towards it. Why am I making those choices? But your question about the beginner, that slide you referenced is really pitched towards the beginner student, which in my estimation is the person who wants to go into a training program because they want to learn more. I don't think it starts in the kind of public class level. It would be very hard given the strictures around time and what studio owners want teachers to do. But when they sign up for a longer program, I feel that my job as somebody who presents the basics of yoga history and philosophy is to say, you have many ways of looking at your life. There are many problems that the books of yoga literature that we've inherited in English translation might be helpful in that process. They each say something different. Please be humble enough to know that not even Sanskrit scholars are clear on precise meanings for all of them. Use this literature to help yourself ask questions. And what I end up doing, I think, is, if the unit is 20 hours or 40 hours, what I hope to do, my intention is to set up trainees for lifelong learning, and to never really be in the position where they're saying, well, yoga is X. And that's why I formulated that slide that way. It's like, okay, let them quote, encourage them to quote with confidence, two basic but opposing or contrasting definitions for yoga and yoga practice, and then let them give their own answer. And the combination of those three things, I think, is probably, it's an integral way of presenting the fact that you are a participant in an ongoing process, and that the culture isn't something that you can either fully define, fully represent, or completely know, because in a way, the culture is like your own inner life.
I think that statement right there is quite profound. I also appreciate that there's a certain subjectivity to it, but there's also that rooted sense of like, okay, well, we're looking at the history. I'm taking the time to actually compare or look at different opinions within the tradition itself. But then I'm also allowed to have my own definition. I mean, trying to say that would be like someone saying, well, like, no, love is this, and you're not loving right because you love a different way. It's like, well, what do you mean? Like, this is love, like, to me. So
we also, and this part about being aware that there are many different definitions and practice cultures through time puts us in this really odd position. Which is, and it's a position that yoga practitioners have never really been in before, unless they have been pundits, and that's really usually been reserved for a very few participants. Any Anglophone yoga practitioner today can be instructed in a number of different pathways, which means that they must somehow be comparative. And if the ethnography or the anthropology of the practice of yoga, Raja Yoga, is correct, we're probably talking about people who were handed down the sutras as mnemonic devices, may not have been literate themselves, would not have had access to every commentary, and may not have had the time in their lives to juxtapose what they were learning and understanding with what the Buddhists were doing 300 miles away. But we live in a different world in which I can be aware of what's happening in the Bihar school of yoga, for good or ill, Anusara yoga, the Vipassana community, IMS, what the Kripalu guys are doing. I mean, what do I do with this awareness of diversity? It's completely new, and it is really the product of a networked brain, and it challenges earlier kind of discourses of faith and authenticity in very profound ways. Because, if you are aware that there are earnest people practicing in 10 different streams, you have to be aware that if you choose one and you devote yourself to it, that somehow you're shutting things out. And that's a very new, very, very modern condition. And it's not something that I have an answer to, but I think it's something that I try to be aware of. And I think we'd all benefit by simply being honest about. We are aware of diversity, and there's and diversity with regard to the faith that people have traditionally had in singular paths might be structurally incompatible.
Well, and there's also the challenge with diversity. I don't know what the science says for the actual number, but I know that there's a lot of research done on, having too many choices. When people start getting too many choices, it kind of paralyzes their capacity to make intelligent choices. And that's kind of where we're at now, where, as you said, we're getting exposure not only to yoga as it is here today, but yoga as it was through all different time zones, through all different parts of India, different belief systems. And so it's like we're getting them all at once. It can definitely be a little overwhelming for people to try to integrate those things, and it can lead to that sort of experience of shutting down. What would you say? For someone who, like yourself, who is really invested not only in in learning more about the history and tradition itself, but also really involved in your own self-inquiry and encouraging that with your students, where would you like to see yoga in the modern world go?
I have two thoughts about that just off the top of my brain, and one kind of links back into the definitional question, which is that while we have this plenitude of paths on offer in the yoga marketplace, and because those paths make whatever modern postural yoga is very difficult for even scholars of religion to define, the thing that sticks modern practice together across the Americas and into Europe at least, and to the extent that global yoga has returned back to India in a transformed way, is that people tend to draw on two different types of discourses when they teach it, and they tend to want two different types of product when they practice it. And those two things are often in contrast. And the way I've begun to start describing it is that yoga is something that offers therapy, but it also offers transcendence. And its therapeutic product is something that is fairly modern, probably only relevant or existing from the early 20th century onwards. And it's wrapped up in ideas of health and wellness and, organic food and naturopathy and, creating a balanced lifestyle for stamina within the rigors of, industrialized middle-class life. It's about adjusting to things. It's about going with the flow. It's about becoming as resilient as possible. Whereas the transcendent aims of the multiple yoga paths that modernity has inherited has really been on the transcendent. How can the self be utterly transformed? nobody is practicing Raja Yoga in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries of the Common Era so that they can adjust more equitably to their middle-class lives. Nobody is practicing the Kriyas out of the Hatha Yoga Pradipika so that they can, be 10% happier, as Sharon Salzberg says, or so they can be, they can gain a little bit more mobility. Practice until the 20th century has been about the breaking down of the conventional self, whereas 20th century onward, it's about the care for, the nurturance, and the building up of the conventional self. And the person who goes to yoga today is offered both, but not necessarily clearly. And one of the things that I would like to see going forward is a little bit more self-reflection and honesty on the part of the industry with regard to what it's actually offering. Is it offering healthcare, or is it offering transcendence? And
would you say that there's room, if I could jump in real quick, would you say there's room within that? I think the therapeutic model kind of offers this as well, but giving that use of transcendent, is there also just that skillfulness in eminence? I mean, maybe that is the therapy, but that contrast between not only like, is this healing for me, but is it like, can I learn to utilize and be more skillful in the embodied experience, which is quite contrasted by the transcendent type of yoga, which they don't, anything that you're doing in the body is an illusion anyways, get up and past it.
Yeah, except that I think we embody transcendence in many different ways, and in particularly non-metaphysical ways, actually, these days. And I'll just take my understanding and dozens and dozens of interviews with Ashtanga practitioners here as a lead, where you have this simultaneity of an incredibly rigorous, elite athletic practice with admonitions towards the subtle body, a focus upon energetics that flow through incredible physical demands that elicit transcendent experiences in terms of their intensity. And so I would say that for many of the Ashtanga practitioners that I have interviewed, the transcendence of ritualized breathing, the trance state of the deep sensations that the incredible mobility of the postures generate, the pain that they withstand, sometimes calling it that, sometimes not calling it that. These are all it's pushing us over into a kind of medieval physicalized performance of the generation of transcendent states. And so a really good example of where that gets confused with therapy is with Pattabhi Jois himself naming that primary series Therapy for the Body. And then me interviewing people who have injured themselves in chronic and sometimes devastating ways, doing that primary series, who keep doing it because they've been told that it will heal them. And so that fundamental tension between the thought of something that will make you well and the thought of something that will pull you apart and make you other, I think that's at the heart of modern yoga. Why is it different from Pilates? Because or aerobics or contact improv, it's because it doesn't have this threshold by which the aspiration towards wellness is constantly stepped over into the aspiration towards self-disillusion. So there's a way in which yoga is saying two things at once. It's saying, I will take care of you and I will destroy you. Both things are good. And I want us to be a little bit more clear about the fact that we're saying both of those things at the same time, so that people who just really want to have therapy don't, rip the crap out of their joints or go on 10-day Vipassana retreats, which are incredibly intense, and push people generally over into altered states and transcendent experiences, when what they really want to do is to just self-regulate a little bit better.
Yeah, there was a training when I lived in Thailand that my one of my teachers was putting on there, and it would happen every year. And every year, it was a 3-month training that was immersive. So people would go live on this island, and they'd live on the land and do this training. And we would do this technique called Ekadasi, which it's 11 days. It takes 12 to fully complete, but it was a really powerful breathing technique that unlocks a lot of stored stuff from the subconscious. And every single year, at least one person would quit the training during that time because they're like, look, I thought I was coming here to learn how to stretch and breathe. I didn't know that I was doing all this like deep emotional work and all this stuff was going to come up. Like, I'm out of here. And it's like you said, it's really important to be clear about what is being offered.
Well, here's
so that
the other
people
thing
know what
is
to
that,
expect.
is that with a technique like that, and I'd have to know a little bit or ask you a little bit more about that specific experience. So I'm not going to particularly refer to it, but a technique that is presented, as having Sanskritic heritage that provokes a certain amount of intensity, will often be presented as though it is both good for you in wellness terms, and it is transformative or deconstructive in spiritual terms. And the difficulty there is that it's usually administered by people who really don't have their own therapeutic chops in place. In terms of scope of practice, informed consent. Like, I'd want to ask questions about, did you know what you were getting into the first time you did that thing? And there might have been one person that left, but how many people were actually on the edge of saying, what did I sign up for, and why wasn't this explained to me? Because that's one of the benchmarks for a therapeutic technique is, does the client know what they're buying, and have they been given informed consent? And the thing about the transcendent technique and spiritual economy in general is that there's very little informed consent. And in fact, there may not be able to be informed consent, because the person who would actually say yes to the spiritual practice is exactly the person that the spiritual practice itself is probably saying is deluded. So it's not like you can say, yes, I fully consent to be torn apart by this process. It can't work like that. So there's this fundamental tension, I think, that I would actually define as being the heart of modern yoga practice. It has historical elements to it, this therapeutic turn at the beginning of the 20th century, but it also plays out in terms of how the marketing, the discourse, the promises, the industry it makes on the whole are kind of given with a forked tongue. Like, this is really good for you. This is really going to tear you apart. And that tension, I think, is really at the heart of it, for good or ill.
I love listening to you speak, because as you're talking, like it triggers all these other little thoughts, like, ooh, I want to go down that rabbit hole, and I want to ask you more about this, and let's talk about that some more. And I really feel like I'd be happy to continue the conversation for quite some time, but for the sake of our audience, and we are on a podcast, so kind of wrapping things up a little bit there, I do want to talk, and we mentioned before, there's some other topics that I would love to have you on the show in the future about. But for now, to kind of segue in, you have a project. There's a book that you're working on, the WAWADIA Project, which really kind of talks a lot about this. Is incorporating. I mean, it's kind of the foundation, it seems like, for this conversation itself. For those that are unfamiliar, it's WAWADIA stands for What Are We Actually Doing in Asana? I was wondering if you could tell our listeners a little bit about that, and about your website, the work that you do, the offerings that you have, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, thanks. Well, my website is just my name plus a .com, and I think it's pretty easy to navigate. If you scroll maybe 2/3 of the way down, the articles section is there, and that seems to get a fair amount of traffic. the WAWADIA Project emerged out of, really coming down out of the busyness of a decade worth of teaching, community organizing, working as an Ayurvedic consultant, and really starting to take stock of, what were all of the stories that I'd heard along the way that I'd kind of shoved off to the side. Like, why was it that almost everybody that I knew in yoga land who had professionalized, who was a dedicated student, either had a story of chronic injury, repetitive stress injury, or a story of being intrusively or even violently adjusted by a senior teacher who they may have decided that they hated later, or they may have still been in love with. And what I wanted to do was, on the basis of these stories, really try to look underneath the marketing language of the culture to see if there are some, coherent themes that connect these shadow regions together, and make the entire modern yoga scene a little bit less rosy than it wants to be. A lot of it came out of, a huge amount of it came out of long conversations with my partner, Alex, as we waited for our first child to arrive. And I was drawing down my teaching schedule and she was drawing down hers. And we had a lot of time to talk about, this strange, wonderful, sometimes painful and somewhat corrupt industry that we were involved in. At a certain point, she told me a couple of triggering stories about her own injuries, and I just threw out a request on Facebook, maybe it's close to 3 years now ago, seeing if there was anybody who was willing to talk to me personally about injury experiences that they'd had. And I was just totally overwhelmed. For a while, I thought that the questions involved were really as simple as, how can we get less people to be injured? And, that's valuable, but it's also, far beyond my own scope. I realized that what I was really starting to research was the psychosocial dynamics of practice, and how people actually came into yoga to either practice or teach, with, of course, a lot of the baggage that they had accumulated in the outside world or from prior conditioning. And, the way I describe it for myself is that, I went to yoga to try to reach out of the body of patriarchy. And when I arrived, I kind of found myself back in it. And so it's really, the work has really migrated from a study of injury to using injury circumstances to explore some of the interpersonal dynamics that dominate within practice culture, especially between teachers and students. What are we actually doing in asana? I've got a lot of answers for that now. None of them are final, but I think it has a lot to do with, how are we relearning to move according to conditionings that may replicate things that made us feel comfortable in childhood for good or bad reasons. I often feel like we're recreating, family somatized dynamics in classrooms. We are carrying the wounds of, physical oppression and violence into classrooms. And either those are externalized between teachers and students, or they're internalized by students, let's face it, the whole, sex and power abuse rampage of the modern postural yoga world is kind of a really, really big red flag for a generalized inquiry into, what are these rooms about? Like, what are people doing? What are they reenacting in order to either have a repeat experience or in either to try to heal something that's constitutes unfinished business. So yeah, there's lots of speculative answers, but the book is no longer a survey of people who got injured and how. It's a little bit more of a journalistic effort into what are some of the key influences that have that have cast long shadows over this culture globally, and why is it that we've continually suppressed or whitewashed those shadows.
Well, Matthew, I love that you're doing the work that you're doing. I think you have a brilliant mind, and I love the conversation and inquiry that you stimulate, not only within yourself and people that are contacting you, but within the yoga community or with the air quotes spiritual communities out there. But I think that's really important, and I really value and appreciate the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for bringing up these conversations within the community. I think it's a great work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and and you as well. Thanks for hosting and for all of your efforts.
Absolutely. Thank you. And for all our listeners out there, I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully we'll get Matthew back again in the future to talk with us on some other topics. I hope you've enjoyed the chat, and I hope you all have a very present moment. Thank you so much for listening today. Namaste. Hey everybody, if you have a spare minute, please go over to iTunes, leave us a rating and a review. We really appreciate it. And if you're on Facebook, check out our new Facebook group. It's the same name as our blog, Savannah East. Thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaheast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.